Hello everyone, I'm Anna Hause from Hashimoto Health. This is the following webinar in the series Introduction to Immunity with Carolin Hoffmann. Welcome, Carolin. Let me present you, Carolin, with some words. She is an outstanding researcher with international background in the field of neuroscience and protein expression, with a special interest in neuropsychoimmunology. She received her bachelor degree at Maastricht University, and she did her master degree at Karolinska Institute in Sweden. She received a Kostra Talent Fellowship to join the School of Mental Health and Neurosciences and studied the presence of autoantibodies in sera of patients with severe mental illness. And she received a PhD fellowship from the Graduate School of Translational Neuroscience to proceed with her research. Welcome, Carolin, and thank you for joining us today.
I have some background on autoimmunity in general, so that's what I would like to talk also about today. And I think, the structure might be a little bit different to the previous webinars of what I've seen. It's a little bit in a lecture style, so I have some slides and I'm going to give an introduction first on what is the immune system, to understand then also what happens if we develop an autoimmune disease. I'm trying to describe a little bit the biological backgrounds and what it is that causes autoimmune disease, why we develop these, and then very quickly I will also go into how antibodies or immunity could cause psychosis or psychiatric symptoms.
Great.
So let me open my slides. So you can see well?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to start with the immune system. What is the immune system and what do we need it for? So it's the body's own defense mechanism against anything that could cause a disease within the body. So you can think of infections such as bacteria, viruses, fungi, but also malfunctioning cells. So malignant cells, for example, cancer cells, they're also being attacked by the immune system because they are disease causing for the body. So they should also be cleaned up, and any kind of foreign particle. So the immune system has many cells, but in general, I marked a little bit a simplified scheme of what these kind of cells could look like. So this is an immune cell. And the important thing of what an immune cell has to do is mainly to recognize what is foreign to the body or what could be pathogenic. So to do that, the cell needs certain receptors here that are these parts in the membrane, or so the surface of the cell. And these type of receptors can recognize different patterns. So for example, here the flagellum of a bacteria, or the surface of different types of bacteria, but also different type of viruses or DNA and RNA. And so there is a row of very different types of receptors that can recognize different pathogens. So anything that can cause a disease in the body. But like I mentioned, there's not just one type of cell in the immune system, but there's a group of different cells and also molecules. So here it's a lot of information, but no worries, I'm going to walk you through. I hope it's going to be followable. So we start here with the purple circle. This is what we call the innate immune system, because we can distinguish the immune system into innate and adaptive. So what does that mean? Well, the innate immune system here, it's a row of different type of cells. They have more general pattern recognition receptors. So that means they have an innate spectrum of receptors that does not change. You have it in your genes. So since birth, your cells have these receptors and they do not change with infection or during our lifetime. So they just stay the same. And this is why, if we look here in the bottom at the time after infection, what happens? So in the first phase, we get a very fast response of this innate immune cells because they are ready. They have their receptors and they're ready to act. So they can react very fast to anything that enters the body. At the same time, they are a little less specific because these receptors that they have are so general. So they react fast, but not so specific. If we then, in contrast, look at the adaptive immune system, so this is the circle here on the right side, we also have different types of cells. It already says in the name that it is adaptive, so it changes the receptors and what it can recognize. So actually these receptors on the cells are very variable. So every cell has a very, very different type of receptors, and you have a huge variety of different receptors, and they keep changing. So it's a very, the piece of DNA is just shuffled around to create very different and broad spectrum type of receptors on these cells. So they can recognize very, very different things, and also novel things that the body might not have seen before or that are less general. And this enables the cell to have a very, very targeted and very specific reaction to certain pathogens. So it's not recognizing a lot of different bacteria, but it's really usually very targeted to one small characteristic of a pathogen. And this makes it very targeted, very efficient in their way, but also, as you see here in the blue line, their response takes longer because they have to develop, they change, they mature, how we call it, into an active cell. Because also in the beginning, we have a very broad spectrum of these cells, but only if they recognize something, and if several cells, actually if they interact, they're being really activated to act on what they recognize. So just being able to recognize something does not really mean that the immune system is going to attack us, but there is a row of events that have to happen to really attack the invader, so to say. So I will explain a little more about the so-called T cells and B cells that we have in the adaptive immune system. So to do that, first I want to mention what is an antigen and an antigen presenting cell. So antigen is what we say to anything that our immune system can target. So the receptors are recognizing something, and this something is the antigen. So that's just the naming how we call it. And the antigen presenting cell is a cell that engulfs, so these cells is actually from the innate immune system, so from the first part of cells that I explained, and they recognize these general pathogens, they engulf it, so when they see something foreign, they're going to eat it up, and they're going to put it into pieces and expose the pieces on the surface. So they say, okay, I encountered this pathogen and it looks like this and like this and like this. So like here the cell has the flags, how it shows this is what I've seen and this is what doesn't belong here. We should get rid of it. And then comes the T cell. And the T cell recognizes these patterns by the antigen presenting cell. And it says, okay, so this is what I have to destroy or to get rid of in our body. It doesn't belong here. And then there's also different cells. So there's the T helper cell, which is a cell that is more meant to instruct other cells. So these immune cells communicate with each other with chemicals called cytokines. And the helper cell mainly produces a lot of different cytokines to tell other cells what to do, if they should act. So they have pro-inflammatory cytokines, meaning they tell cells in the surrounding that something is happening, we have to get active, get ready, and get an inflammation going. If the cell can also do the opposite, it also has so-called anti-inflammatory cytokines, so it can also signal other cells not to react, even if they see something, for example, that they think might be something that doesn't belong here. But if the helper says no, this is something not relevant, the other cells are not going to react to it. On the other side, we also have the cytotoxic T cell, and this is the cells that really are going to out there and fight. So it's the warrior of the story, and they are really, if they are activated here by the antigen presenting cell, they're going to go out and they're really going to kill cells that are infected, or cells or just foreign cells or bacteria or viruses. So what then the T cell does, so this is just another scheme of what happened. So this was the antigen presenting cell, which has seen this antigen and is then presenting it to the T cell. So the T cell gets activated, and in turn it can activate the B cell. And this it does via what I mentioned as the cytokines. So it's communicating to the B cell that this is actually something that could be dangerous, so it should be cleaned up. And if the B cell is recognizing the same antigen, it's going to be activated. So it's kind of a control mechanism. Oh yeah, I've seen the same thing. It must be something pathogenic. Let's go clean it up. And the B cell has a different type of fighting. And the tool of the B cells is the antibodies. So here comes a very important part of the immune system, the antibodies, which you might have heard of before, because in Hashimoto we also have antibodies targeting the thyroid gland. So what are these antibodies? They are here, as you can see, also on the surface of the B cells, but the B cell can also secrete a lot of these. So you get free-floating antibodies. They get into the blood and into the circulation, and they go all around your body. So they can target whatever they are recognizing, the antigen, and they go all over the body and bind to what they recognize. And if we look at here what an antibody looks like, so here is the shape of an antibody. So it has these two arms, and on the top of the arm here is the so-called variable region. So that's the region that changes a lot, but once the cell is activated and it's the one cell, it's going to be the same. It's not going to change anymore. But this is the part that recognizes the antigen. So we have two sides of this, and we also have here, which is called the FC part, and this you can also imagine a little bit like the flag of alert, but it is it doesn't say what the antigen looks like or anything. It only gives a signal to other immune cells that whatever the antibody binds to should be cleaned up. So for example here, if the antibody is, well, this is one mechanism, even if nothing else binds to it. If the antibody binds to, for example, here a virus, it kind of neutralizes it, because there are so many antibodies all binding around the virus that it cannot do anything. It's blocked. It cannot bind to a cell. It's not infectious anymore. But then usually, like I mentioned, because the other part of the antibody here is recognized by other immune cells, so-called macrophages. These cells are going to recognize it and also clean it up. So the antibodies kind of signal, this is something we don't want to have here, and then other cells come and recognize, okay, let's clean it up. So the macrophage is just going to engulf the whole thing and eat it up. Another thing that antibodies can do is when they bind, they're going to activate another factor of the immune system, which is called the complement system, or here the complement proteins. And what they do is that they induce pores. So they make small holes in the surface of the cell, so the cell is going to die from it, because it's not going to be intact, it's going to break down, so the cell can die from just the antibodies in the membrane, inducing loss of the membrane, the protection of the cell. So the antibody can have very different type of functions. Actually, the antibody, even by itself, without inducing any immune response, it can already change. If it binds especially to antigens in the surface of the membrane, it can change the function of certain proteins as well. So what happens now in the autoimmunity? Because then something goes wrong. So we have cells that want to destroy one of their own cells, even though, it's one of their own, but they cannot distinguish between, so they lose this, possibility of what I mentioned in the beginning. It's very important to recognize what's foreign, but it's then, just as important to make the distinction of what is our own. Because, if the immune system cannot distinguish, it starts attacking the own cells, and this is what happens in autoimmunity. And there is different mechanisms that should avoid this from happening. So the immune system, of course, has some mechanisms of avoiding self-reaction, and so they try to keep self-tolerance, what it's called. So you do not react to your self-antigens. So this is a little complex image, but I will walk you through it again. So the cells come here from the bone marrow. This is where your lymphocytes, which are also the T cells and B cells, are produced. And then they enter the thymus. In the thymus, the cells mature and can get activated, but also can undergo apoptosis, which means controlled cell death. Because if they, so the thymus is a very special organ. The cells of the thymus produce all kind of different antigens from all over the body, just to present it to your immune cells and show this is what your body looks like. Do not react to it. So the thymus epithelium has really a wide range of proteins and antigens that it produces. So it's going to show this is what your liver looks like, this is what your muscle looks like, this is what your nerves look like. Do not react to anything of this. And if a T cell receptor does recognize it, it's undergo cell death. So in this process, whenever something recognizes your own body, it should already undergo apoptosis, so cell death. If it does not recognize any of these, it's free to go, and it's going to induce just immunity, but healthy immunity, what it should be doing to recognize foreign antigens. But of course, this is why autoimmunity can develop. There's also some that escape, because still the thymus is doing a pretty good job in showing all the things that can be in the body, but there might always be some things that the thymus did not produce and did not show to the T cell. So there might be a self-reactive T cell that did not react to anything, but just because the thymus didn't show it to the cell. And the cell is going to get into the blood, into the periphery, all over the body. And there's a second line of a checkpoint, so to say. So the peripheral tolerance. So this was the central tolerance system. And then if it escapes this, there's even a second line of mechanism that should inhibit autoimmunity from happening. Because if cells react an antigen on a cell, it's usually not enough. There have to be other cofactors, for example, other receptors in the cell that say this is really a pathogen. If this is not present, the cell is not gonna get activated. And also what I mentioned by the T regulatory cells. So if the T cell recognizes an autoantigen on an antigen presenting cell, you could imagine that now it's going to react to it. But if the helper T cell sends the cytokines that say no, it's immunosuppressant environment, we don't need an inflammation right now, the cell is not going to react to it. Also, some antigen presenting cells, if they have a self-antigen and the T cell is going to recognize it, they're going to kill the cell that acts on a self-antigen. So there's another layer of protection against these cells. So it's pretty safe system if you look at how it's designed. There's a lot of checkpoints for cells to be sure that it does not react to your body. But yeah, sometimes things can go wrong. So how can it be that still these cells recognize your own body if there's so many checkpoints? So yeah, I have some more slides to explain this further. So one way is explained here, because a lot of times autoimmunity, not always, but a lot of times it happens when there's already tissue damage due to, for example, infections. So if you have a virus and it already damaged your tissue, it can be, well, actually even without the tissue damage, but you have a cell that's correctly recognizing the antigen of the virus. So this is completely what it should be doing, but it can sometimes be that something pathogenic looks extremely similar to something in the body, especially for T and B cells, because it's usually not a very big molecule that's part of what's recognized, but it can be, like I mentioned, a very specific thing, and this thing can sometimes be very small. So if a T cell recognizes a pathogen, it can look just so close to something in your body that it's going to cross-react, so to say. And this is called molecular mimicry, because it's like, it's like fake looking the same. So mimicry, like looking the same, and yeah, it's just cross-reacting to both the pathogen and your own body. But there's other ways. So this is even a little more complex, but I'll walk you through it again. So here again, it starts often with the inflammation. So here we already have tissue damage. And the antigen, again, here also the pathogen is going to be activated correctly. But at the same time, if you already have this inflammatory environment and a lot of self-antigens, so because of the tissue damage, you have a lot of more exposure to different kinds of autoantigens in the tissue, the cell is much more likely to take up one of your own antigens and also present it to the T cell. So then the T cell thinks that this is actually part of the pathogen, even though it's actually your own body. But then it cannot distinguish anymore because the cell has taken up both. And it's already this inflammatory environment. And this even aggravates because now the T cell is activated, so it's gonna undergo clonal expansion, what we say, so it's gonna multiply, and there's gonna be more cells of the same type with the same receptor, and they're gonna induce even more tissue damage because now it's recognizing your own body, and more of your tissue is coming free. And more antigens are again taken up by the cell, and new antigens can be recognized. So now you have not just one type of antigen being recognized, but even several of them. So if we look at Hashimoto, for example, it might be that first they only have TPO antibodies, but because the tissue keeps breaking down, then you also develop antibodies against other antigens in your tissue, which then could be the thyroglobulin, the TG antibodies. Yeah, so this is called epitope spray. But now, why do we develop autoimmunity? What is the etiology of the disease? So in general, autoimmunity is quite common. It affects 7 to 9% of the population if we look at all the different autoimmune diseases there are. And it's usually a very diverse and complex etiology of the disease. So there's many different factors that integrate to really develop the disease in the end. So there's different genes that have been discovered, such as the MHC complex, which is actually the genes encoding for the structures that hold the antigens in the antigen presenting cells, because the antigen presenting cells, they expose the antigens in the surface, like I explained before, and there's a structure holding those, and the genes that encode for these structures are also involved. So it shows already that some mechanism is going wrong in the presenting of the wrong antigens. But yeah, there's other genes also that have been described as risk factors for different types of autoimmune diseases. So for example, in Hashimoto thyroiditis, there's also several of these MHC complex genes that have been shown as a risk factor to develop Hashimoto thyroiditis. Other genes involved in T cell regulations, cytokines, for example, or genes for T cell receptors. Also, in Hashimoto, there are some that are related to thyroid hormone regulation or production. So actually in the genes that encode the thyroglobulin, for example, but also the selenoprotein in the body, which seems to be part of the metabolism in the thyroid, could also play a role. So there's different types of genes that can be a risk factor. Also, environment, of course, is very important in the development of these diseases. Here we can think of having the infections, like I mentioned. This is pretty general for all kinds of autoimmune diseases. If there's especially chronic inflammation already present in the body, it's much more likely to develop some kind of dysfunction in the immune system, including the autoimmunity. Actually, in Hashimoto thyroiditis, it has been seen that the disease develops much, it's increasing the prevalence over the last years. And one of the hypotheses is also that we live much more hygienic. So actually the reduced exposure to pathogens can also change our immune system, because especially during young ages, we're less exposed to bacteria and different infections, which might impair our development of the immune system. So it's actually contra-intuitive, but actually we might have an impaired immune system from having less infections. There's different environmental factors also for Hashimoto thyroiditis. Actually, a lot of things are also related to nutrition. So, for example, the increased iodine uptake, which is also increased a lot during the last years, is also a risk factor to develop Hashimoto thyroiditis, the same as decreased levels of selenium or vitamin D can also play a role in Hashimoto thyroiditis. And then together with the immune regulation, which is actually also influenced then by the genes and the environment, can induce autoimmune diseases. And also Hashimoto thyroiditis. Actually, an interesting thing with Hashimoto thyroiditis, what I read was that actually smoking and drinking decrease the risk for this disease, which is, yeah, I mean, I haven't seen this with many other diseases. So, but well, I would never recommend starting smoking and drinking because obviously the risk for other diseases will increase a lot. But it's an interesting idea to think about mechanisms that could be behind it. But yeah, at the moment, I don't understand how this can be related, but it's very interesting finding. Yeah, if we look at the pathogenesis, so what happens in an autoimmune disease, I mean, molecularly, I already explained a bit why do cells react to your own body. But then what kind of disease you develop, of course, depends on what are the antigens. So what does the immune system react against? And that can be very, very broad because we have autoimmune diseases against pretty much any part of the body. So you can think here of rheumatoid arthritis in the joints, but also the central nervous system can be targeted, the pancreas, like in type 1 diabetes, or the intestines in inflammatory bowel disease. So it really depends on where the antibodies or T cells target, can have very broad spectrum of symptoms. So yeah, I guess you know that in Hashimoto thyroiditis, the target is the thyroid gland, and there's also different antigens involved there. So it's the most common one are the thyroid peroxidase, TPO, and the thyroglobulin, TG. And yeah, if we look at the function of the thyroid here, so the production of thyroid hormones, of course, which is stimulated by the pituitary, from the hypothalamus via the pituitary gland to stimulate thyroid hormones. Obviously, when this is impaired, the thyroid hormone is going to go down. Usually, it goes into your blood circulation and can have various effects on different organs, mainly metabolism. This is just a few of them. It's many more. It can have on eyes, brain, kidney, skin, uterus, also gastrointestinal tract, liver, heart, lungs. So it really affects a wide range of your organs. And this is also what we see in the symptomatology, because I mean, we actually only target the thyroid gland, but because the thyroid hormones have a very wide spectrum of mechanisms, we also see very wide spectrum of symptoms in this disease. And actually this is my part on the background of what is autoimmunity, what is the immune system. And then I would have just very few slides on the immunity in psychiatric disorders. Yeah, are there any or other questions until here? It was
no. Let's proceed, and we can move to the questions later. Yeah.
Okay. So what we see in psychosis in general, in patients with psychosis, is that the patients often have a chronic dysfunction of the immune system, and this is shown by different subsets of immune cells, for example. So I've shown how there can be regulatory T cells, and there's cytotoxic T cells, and also there's actually, I didn't go into details because there's even more different subtypes of the helper cells and so on. So we have mainly then those present or increased prevalence of those that induce the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and less of those that produce the anti-inflammatory cytokines. So in general, over a chronic time, there's going to be higher levels of inflammatory markers systemically all over the body. And how this can lead to psychosis is not completely clear yet, but there's an hypothesis of how different things come together to induce changes of the brain. So for example, it has been shown that infections, especially in early life, and also trauma of different ways. Even also infections when the child is still in the womb of the mother can change the development of the immune system. And then if during the life a person encounters additional trauma and stress, and it might even have a genetic predisposition, because also for psychiatric disorders there's a lot of genetic factors that can play a role. If all of this comes together, it can induce immunological changes also within the brain. But yeah, this is an adding up of different events during lifetime. And interestingly, more recently, there was a new type of disease discovered where actually autoantibodies target the brain itself. It's complicated name. It's called NMDA receptor encephalitis. So NMDA receptor is a neuro receptor in the brain, very important for neuronal signaling, so for communication of neurons within the brain. And if in this disease, antibodies target this receptor, and they induce an internalization, so just decreased presence of these receptors in the neurons, so it's less functional. And interestingly, these patients develop also psychiatric symptoms, but also neurological. So very typical presentation of this disease is that in the first weeks, they look very similar to, for example, schizophrenia. They have hallucinations, delusions, also personality changes, often aggressiveness, and then it progresses, and they might also develop seizures, epileptic seizures, loss of consciousness, or also movement disorders, up to coma. And if these patients are not treated, they might also die. But in around 4% of these patients, we only see the psychiatric symptoms. So they kind of they stay in this first phase that looks very similar to schizophrenia. So we thought that, or we still think, and different people got this hypothesis because there was already an idea that there could be some autoimmune cause in schizophrenia and similar disorders. Also these type of antibodies might play a role in these diseases. And this was confirmed. So then different cohorts of schizophrenia and bipolar disorders were tested, and it seems that these antibodies are increased, but not only against NMDA receptor, but also other neuronal antigens. So other things in the brain are being targeted. And the very relevant part is that these patients react very, very well to immunosuppressive treatment. It takes some time for them to recover. It can be up to 1 year, but a lot of times they undergo complete regression and they're completely fine afterwards and can go back to normal life. So it's still very recent, and a lot of research has to be done in the field to really confirm this hypothesis. And of course, it's not all schizophrenia patients. It's a small subgroup of patients that might have this as a cause. So it's kind of misdiagnosed psychotic disorders. So we think there's increased autoantibodies that target the brain in patients with psychotic symptoms. So this was my presentation.
Great. I could not imagine presenting in a more clear way. Thank you, Carolin. Really. I was a little humbled. So listened like for the first time. Yeah, really great. Thank you. I was thinking, coming back to the last story of you referring to psychiatric complaints, because you see a lot of Hashimoto thyroiditis patients are suffering from depression, anxiety, and of course there are people who are showing in the research we know with other bipolar disorder and also psychotic moments, but most of the people are reporting depression and anxiety. And I'm wondering, what is your opinion? Because I think that this might be also as a symptom of autoimmunity. And we talked about it. We probably don't know why, but a lot of people react on antidepressiva, for example, in a negative way, and their symptoms even worsen. What is your position about it? I know that there is a lot in the research, but just brainstorming might be the cause.
Yeah, actually, yeah, that it was very interesting to think about, because I was before I met you not so aware of all the symptoms that these also Hashimoto thyroiditis patients suffer from, and I think the problem is, of course, it has just never been studied. So I don't want to make too much of an hypothesis, but I think it is not unlikely that the autoimmunity can also play a role in this. I mean, in depression, there's a similar hypothesis, like I explained it with the multiple hit hypothesis of just in general a changed immune system and increased levels of inflammation. So this, I think we might also just see that in patients with autoimmune disease, that there's over an extended period of time increased levels of inflammation, which can induce a kind of sickness behavior, which is then can express itself as depression, for example. I mean, I would be very, very speculative in saying there might be other antibodies in these patients, that because I think, and I'm not sure, I mentioned, because a lot of times as soon as you have one autoimmune disease, it's what I mean with this parent, it's very common to develop other autoimmune diseases, especially with age. So the older you get, in general, the more likely you are to develop an autoimmune disease. But if you already develop one, it's much more likely then to also develop others. I mean, in Hashimoto thyroiditis, this is known, for example, with Addison's disease, which then addresses the adrenal gland, and also diabetes or arthritis and so on. So it can be that there's other antibodies. The thing is that it has just never been studied. But I think it's also because now this field of antibodies targeting the brain is very, very recent. The NMDA receptor was pretty much the first. That was 2007. So it's not even 10 years ago. So it takes time to develop these things. But I think now with the new findings that this is even an opportunity. I think people didn't think about this option before. So I think this is a very interesting line of new research that has to be investigated. But I'm not aware of anyone looking into this at the moment.
Yeah. And but what makes it quite difficult to diagnose Hashimoto on time? Because you see that you mentioned something from the beginning, that there is so broad, the thyroid hormone is reacting on so many organs and is related to that. Is that the picture is vague? I mean, that gives, or is there another reason?
Yeah, I think it's really
that if we diagnose on time, you can save still the thyroid glands, and from the research is well studied. When you know that if it is diagnosed on time, people suffer less from symptomatic, and the thyroid gland can be more intact.
Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, I'm not a clinician, but of what I understood from talking to my colleagues from the clinic, I think it's really just this broad spectrum of symptoms, also because every patient can have very different types of symptomatology, also because it's not just broad, it's very general symptoms that are not specific at all for this disease, but that occur in so many different circumstances that it's very difficult to pinpoint it to the thyroid dysfunction. Mm-hmm. I think that's the main problem.
And is there any explanation why in the first phases of the disease you see more this psychiatric complaints? Can you immunologically think about why in this initial period of the disease, there you see it as more like, and very easily to be misdiagnosed as psychiatric disease?
Actually, no, I wouldn't. I think the problem is also that we don't really know what causes exactly the thyroid dysfunction, because for a lot of actually there's a lot of autoimmune diseases where we just don't understand what's the initial trigger, but for Hashimoto we really don't really know, because sometimes it can be a certain type of inflammation or like this mimicry thing like I mentioned, but I think this would help also then to understand why we could have certain symptoms or not. But I wouldn't dare to speculate. No.
Yeah, I don't understand the hard science. We'll wait some years more. I was thinking more about, that you mentioned in your lecture also about usage of the when there is exaggerated immune response, that's the immunosuppressive drugs can be helpful. And I've made some research, but it's not so much related to why we don't use it by, for example, by Hashimoto's. You can prescribe thyroid hormonal therapy, which is actually, of course, helping people to keep living. You need it when the thyroid gland is not functioning properly, but it is not solving the problem with autoimmunity. Do you have an idea why it is not used?
Yeah, actually, I was wondering the same. So I asked again my colleague from the clinic, and he said that it's mainly because, well, firstly, that the diagnosis anyway so late, that the thyroid is already so dysfunctional that it's not worth. It's already too late, so you cannot recover the thyroid anymore if it's so broken down. Even if you give immunosuppressant drugs, you might stop the process of further degradation, but it's already too late. That person already has to take the thyroid hormones. And another thing is that also immunosuppressant drugs can be quite aggressive. It's so the thyroid hormones are no severe side effects or anything, they just replace what is missing, whereas the immunosuppressant drugs, of at least those that are available at the moment, are usually very general, so they suppress your whole immune system, which makes you very susceptible for other inflammation or for infections. And you cannot live your normal life. You have to be very careful in what you do and not getting infections. And if you get an infection, it can grow very fast because your immune system is really down. So it is not something you give very easily. But maybe in the future, if we study this better, what can be an option is to have more targeted drugs against the specific antibodies or T cells that are really targeting the thyroid, so you don't suppress the whole immune system, but only those cells that are the problem. But this doesn't exist yet. And I think it also depends on the type of autoimmune diseases. It's usually different types of immune diseases react better to immunosuppressant. So, for example, the one that I mentioned, an MDA receptor, and these types of antibodies are mainly antibody mediated. So T cells don't play such a big role in the development of this disease, and those react very well for treatment with immunosuppressants. Diseases that are more T cell mediated usually don't react so well to the immunosuppressant treatment.
Explanation.
So also, in Hashimoto, it's both involved. So it would be something that you would need to take forever. Because in like antibody-mediated disease, it can be that you just take it for a few months, it's over, and you're fine, and you don't need it anymore. But in Hashimoto, it would probably something that you would need to. Well, I'm not sure about this one because I'm not a clinician, but I assume that this is also a reason that you cannot take it forever.
Yeah, coming back to what you said, you see that the anti-TPOs and anti-TGs are most often seen by Hashimoto's, but not always. So you have about 10-50% of the people who has Hashimoto thyroiditis, but you don't see antibodies. How it comes?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I also don't know whether this is actually known, but I know from other autoimmune diseases that, yeah, it can be other antigens. So it can be something else in the thyroid that is being targeted that we're just not aware of. But yeah, I know, for example, it's a rare disease, but in myasthenia gravis, it's also that nearly, most of the patients target the acetylcholine receptor, but then there is more recently, then they've found that there's also MuSK, and then so there can be different types of antigens that maybe we're not aware of yet. Mm-hmm. I guess that could be an option.
Yeah. And the other thing that probably, like a last question that I can think of, and a little bit walking towards a closure, we talked about how indeed what you present, our immune system, it looks like perfectly built, with all the checkups and controls, but you see that sometimes it's not, or for whatever reason, is making mistakes. And I was wondering what does the immune system needs in order to be able to, let's say, is there a mechanism that we can learn or go to the stop self-attacking, let's say?
Yeah, I think this is very difficult, especially most commonly once it went wrong, it's very difficult to go back. I'm not aware of anything you can do as a person to, a part of these environmental factors that I mentioned, to be sure that, even infections, you don't have so much, of course you try not to get infected with anything, but it's very difficult to actively do something about it. I think I couldn't think of that. I mean, in this case, not to eat too much iodine and take enough saline in your nutrition, but otherwise, I think there's very little we can do as a person to intervene.
So what you're saying, that we can do things not to make the things worse, but we still don't know something that we can really cure to stop this process. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. So at least at the moment, I mean, like I mentioned, the immunosuppressive treatment in general, but the ones that are available now are not useful for Hashimoto. But there could be ways of then eliminating those cells that are the problem. But I think, again, here, the problem is that we don't understand very well what is really the cause of Hashimoto thyroiditis. If we knew what exactly was the initiating factor, why these cells start targeting the thyroid, it would be easier to go to the cause and make sure that this is not happening again. But because we don't understand where these antibodies come from, or why is it now the thyroid, it's difficult to do something about it if we don't know about what. Yeah. Because I think if we want to do something, we would need to target really the cause. Yeah. But that we don't know yet. I mean, the closest we can get is to target by drugs the cells that are involved. But
Okay. Is there something that you would like to share that probably I missed to open up, or that you find relevant to discuss?
No, I think we covered all the interesting part.
I want to thank you once again a lot for your involvement, for your preparation, and a wonderful speech and lecture.
My pleasure.
Thank you once again.
Thank you.
For your time, Carolin.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.